The moment I boarded the plane, I felt a flicker of unease that I couldn't shake off, a subtle warning whispering in the back of my mind, because nothing had prepared me for the whirlwind that was about to descend at 32,000 feet when I spotted her. The woman everyone in airline horror stories seemed to describe but you never really believed existed until now. Karen, a human storm of entitlement with perfectly coiffed golden hair that seemed to glow under the harsh cabin lights. And A, voice sharp enough to pierce the cabin's ambient hum. Immediately heading straight for the seat I had carefully selected weeks in advance, only to flash a smile that was more predator than passenger and plant herself squarely where my legs were meant to stretch, claiming in a tone dripping with feigned innocence that she had booked this seat months ago, which was clearly a lie because the boarding pass in my hand screamed a different truth. And as I tried to calmly explain that this was my seat, the entire plane seemed to contract into a bubble of tension, passengers turning their heads with a mix of curiosity, anticipation, and fear, sensing that the air itself had thickened with the promise of confrontation. And as she crossed her arms and huffed loudly, her nails clicking against the armrest like a countdown to chaos, I realized that this wasn't going to be one of those polite, forgettable disputes where the flight attendants hand out instructions and everyone quietly complies. No, this was the kind of situation that escalates in ways that you later recount in stories with dramatic flourishes, because Karen, with her golden bob and designer mask dangling from one ear, had perfected the art of entitlement to a degree that bordered on weaponized, and before I could even think to press the call button, she had leaned across my personal space, her perfume, a mix of roses and something aggressively synthetic, invaded my senses and whispered that she really didn't feel like moving, as if the universe owed her comfort, as if the rules of society were suggestions. And while my mind raced through a checklist of airline policies, legalities, and the calming breathing exercises I'd learned from meditation apps I had downloaded and forgotten, I noticed a subtle shift in the cabin, a tightening of jaws and quiet exchanges of glances, because passengers instinctively know when a Karen-level confrontation is imminent, and that moment of collective awareness only fueled the intensity, the electric crackle of anticipation that made the seatbelt sign feel irrelevant compared to the impending storm. And as I stood my ground, finally mustering a polite but firm, "Excuse me, ma'am, that is my assigned seat," she shot me a look that combined indignation, disbelief, and a simmering rage, the kind that fills every corner of a room and makes it difficult to breathe. And then, just as I thought the worst might be over, she let out a shriek, a high-pitched, ear-splitting sound that seemed perfectly designed to summon the attention of the entire aircraft, a sound that carried above the hum of engines and the whisper of other passengers, instantly polarizing the cabin into factions, half staring in horror, half trying to suppress the laughter that threatened to escape despite the absurdity of the situation. And in that instant, I realized that my fight for a simple airplane seat had become the prelude to something far more chaotic, because Karen's shriek wasn't just a noise. It was a battle cry, a signal that the rules of civility were suspended. And as a flight attendant hurried down the aisle, her expression a mix of exhaustion, frustration, and the practiced calm of someone who has seen the worst of human behavior at 30,000 feet. Karen's voice crescendoed into demands, accusations, and threats of legal action, of calling the police, of tweeting the airline into oblivion. And suddenly I was no longer just a passenger. I was a character, in a story that was unfolding in real time, with everyone around me holding invisible bets on whether I would crumble under the weight of this entitled hurricane or stand firm and make her regret the moment she dared to cross my path. And just as the flight attendant reached our row, placing a calming hand on Karen's shoulder, she twisted, gasping in a way that suggested injury or perhaps strategic theater, and the attendant's face betrayed a flicker of panic, because sometimes Karens escalate beyond the point of simple resolution, and in that fraction of a second, a decision hung in the balance, not just about who would sit where, but whether the cabin itself would descend into a spectacle that would be recorded, reposted, and dissected across social media for years to come. And I knew then, with a sinking feeling that combined dread and a rush of adrenaline, that nothing about this flight would proceed normally, that somewhere deep in the recesses of this airplane, plans, contingencies, and the fragile veneer of order would be shattered, because Karen had crossed the threshold into full-blown confrontation mode, and the world, as I knew in the confined quarters of economy class, was about to bend under the weight of her fury. And just as I opened my mouth to respond, to assert my rights with calm reasoning, the lights flickered, The engines hummed louder for an inexplicable moment, and I caught a glimpse of her phone screen, lighting up with what seemed like dozens of live streaming notifications, as if she had already anticipated turning this airplane cabin into her personal stage. And I realized that the story of my seat would now unfold not only in real time for passengers, but potentially broadcast across the globe, a public theater of entitlement. And before I could even process the implications, she leaned back, smirked triumphantly, and whispered, just loud enough for me to hear, "Let's see how far you'll push me." And in that instant, the gentle hum of the plane's routine faded into background noise, replaced by the escalating pulse of tension, because what began as a fight for a seat was transforming into a high-stakes psychological battle, one where every glance, every sigh, every muttered word could tip the scales. And as I felt the weight of the moment pressing down, a subtle grin crept across her face, a smile that promised chaos. And I knew that surviving this flight intact, with dignity in my rightful seat, would require more cunning, patience, and nerve than I had ever imagined. And just as the flight attendant opened her mouth to intervene, the plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jostling passengers, sending a coffee cup flying across the aisle, and in the ensuing chaos, Karen seized the opportunity, standing, blocking my path, her voice rising again to a shrill crescendo, and the cabin erupted into a cacophony of gasps, laughter, and whispered commentary, all while I stood frozen, caught between disbelief, amusement, and a simmering determination to reclaim what was mine, knowing that this was only the beginning, that every second from now would be a test of wills, patience, and strategy. And as the plane continued to ascend, cutting through clouds that glowed faintly in the late afternoon sun, I realized with a mix of horror and fascination that I had unwittingly entered a conflict that would escalate far beyond a simple seat dispute, and somewhere deep inside me a plan began to form, a counterstrike as calculated as it was inevitable, because if Karen thought she could dominate, intimidate, and humiliate me in front of an entire plane, she had severely underestimated the patience, cunning, and resolve of someone who refuses to be sidelined. And just as I squared my shoulders, ready to enact my response, the captain's voice came over the intercom, calm and oblivious to the brewing storm, announcing the expected flight time, the weather, and safety protocols, while behind me, Karen's eyes sparkled with mischief, a predatory glint that promised the drama was only beginning. And with every fiber of my being aware that a single misstep could tip the balance, I prepared myself mentally, physically, and emotionally for the clash that would define this flight, knowing full well that by the time we landed, nothing about this journey would be ordinary. And in that suspended moment between turbulence, tantrums, and tense anticipation, I felt the first real thrill of a confrontation that had begun as a simple dispute over a seat, but had the potential to become the kind of airborne legend whispered about in airports, lounges, and social media forums. A story of entitlement, strategy, and unexpected twists. And as Karen leaned forward once again, smiling slyly as if she already knew my every thought, I realized that the next few hours would test more than patience. They would test ingenuity, courage, and the very limits of human absurdity. Because when a Karen-level storm meets someone who refuses to back down, the results are unpredictable, explosive, and somehow unforgettable. And at that precise moment, just as I gathered my courage to make my move, the overhead compartment above her seat creaked ominously, hinting at yet another unexpected twist in a battle that was only just beginning. As the plane leveled off, I barely had a moment to catch my breath before Karen, clearly energized by the attention her earlier outburst had generated, launched into a new round of theatrics that made my skin crawl. She gestured wildly, accusing me of harassment, while leaning into the aisle as if she owned the airspace itself, and the passengers around us leaned forward in a mixture of fascination and dread, whispering to each other and discreetly recording snippets on their phones. Because some people live for the spectacle of entitlement in action, and I realized that this flight had transformed into a live social experiment with me as an unknowing participant, forced to navigate the absurdity of someone who considered rules optional and politeness a challenge. The flight attendant, a young woman with nerves already frayed from countless similar encounters, tried to mediate, but Karen's volume rose above her, turning her calm requests into a background hum that the plane's speakers couldn't drown out. And I felt every eye on me as if my next move would determine not just who sat where, but the moral fate of everyone in economy class. And while I clenched my fists under the tray table, formulating a strategy that combined diplomacy, psychological maneuvering, and the subtle threat of escalation, Karen's shrill laugh echoed down the aisle, a sound meant to intimidate, to dominate, to make me shrink in place. And in that instant, I realized she wasn't just fighting for a seat. She was fighting for an audience, for attention, for validation, and that made her far more dangerous. Because unlike a normal passenger who might accept a compromise, she thrived on conflict and chaos. And as she leaned toward me once again, her designer handbag swinging like a weapon of mass distraction, I saw the flashing lights of other passengers' phones and knew that any misstep could go viral, with hundreds of strangers judging my response in real time. And just as I opened my mouth to speak, a sudden lurch of the aircraft sent drinks spilling, papers flying, and a collective gasp to the cabin. And in the confusion, Karen seized a moment to stand, turning her tantrum into full-scale theatrics, shouting at the top of her lungs that she had been threatened and demanding that someone, anyone, take immediate action, while the flight attendants scrambled to restore order, their faces masked a controlled panic. And I realized that the battle had escalated far beyond a seat dispute into a complex game of perception, influence, and endurance, where every second of delay, every glance, and every reaction would shape the outcome. And as I prepared to assert myself with the precision of someone who refuses to be cowed, a faint smell of smoke drifted from the back of the plane, immediately setting off alarms in my mind. Because whether real or imagined, it added an unpredictable element to an already combustible situation. And as the captain's voice cut through the chaos with a calm reassurance about minor turbulence ahead, I noticed Karen's eyes flicker, calculating, assessing, as if she was already anticipating my next move. And in that moment, with adrenaline coursing through me and tension coiling tighter than the seatbelt around my waist, I realized that the next confrontation would define the rest of the flight, that the air around us had thickened with suspense, and that every breath, every word, every inch of maneuvering would be critical. Because Karen wasn't just any difficult passenger. She was a force of nature, a spectacle, a challenge. And as she planted herself firmly in my space once again, smirking like she already owned the skies, I felt the first real spark of a plan ignite in my mind, a subtle, cunning counter that could turn the tables and catch her completely off guard. And just as I began to move, adjusting my body for the initial phase of execution, the plane jolted sharply again, this time more violently, sending my tray rattling and passengers gripping their armrests. And in that fleeting, suspended moment between chaos, strategy, and pure absurdity, I realized a mix of fear and exhilaration that the real battle for my seat and for the upper hand in this airborne drama was only just beginning, and that the next few minutes would be a test of nerves, wit, and the limits of human patience. All while hundreds of eyes, both in the cabin and through glowing phone screens, silently judged, recorded, and waited for the first major twist in a confrontation that promised to be unforgettable. By the time the flight had reached cruising altitude, the cabin had transformed from a dull, routine space into a battlefield of wills, and Karen, sensing that her theatrics had secured the attention she craved, shifted into a more aggressive form of intimidation, leaning over the armrest, pointing at my boarding pass as if it were a weapon, and repeating over and over, with a venomous mix of faux sweetness and simmering rage, that she had the right to this seat while the passengers around us leaned in, some whispering, others smirking, many recording, all anticipating the inevitable clash. And I could feel the eyes of the entire plane weighing on me, silently daring me to react, to falter, to surrender. But I refused to be bullied, my mind running through every possible tactic, from calm verbal negotiation to subtle manipulation of the environment, while Karen's energy seemed inexhaustible, a perfect storm of entitlement and performance. And just when I thought the situation might plateau, she produced her trump card, a live video call on her phone, broadcasting her version of events to an invisible audience, complete with exaggerated gestures, distorted whining, and selective cuts to the passengers' reactions. And in that instant, the stakes multiplied, because my response would no longer be private. It would be instantly immortalized across social media, leaving me exposed to judgment from thousands of strangers, and the realization sharpened my focus, igniting a careful, deliberate strategy that I had been formulating in fragments over the previous tense minutes, while Karen, sensing my hesitation, escalated further, raising her voice, accusing me of everything from personal attacks to threatening behavior, and the cabin, already thick with tension, seemed to vibrate with anticipation. Passengers shifting nervously in their seats, flight attendants exchanging frantic glances, and even the captain's voice, calm and authoritative over the intercom, felt powerless to mitigate the storm. Because the turbulence of human behavior, it seemed, was far more unpredictable than that of the skies. And as I mentally prepared to take control, I noticed a subtle shift. A few passengers, previously silent, were now inching closer, ready to intervene or at least support whichever side gained momentum, and that gave me an idea, a small but crucial edge, because Karen's power relied on isolation, on the perception that she could dominate without challenge. And now, with even a subtle undercurrent of resistance forming around me, the balance was no longer entirely in her favor, yet I had to act carefully, because one misstep could ignite chaos that no one, not the crew, not the passengers, could control, and I began to execute my plan with measured precision, a calm, seemingly casual repositioning of my body to reclaim space, a subtle shift of tone to assert authority without aggression, a glance and a nod to nearby passengers to discreetly garner silent support, all while Karen's attention remained focused on theatrics, oblivious to the slow, inevitable encroachment of my strategy. And just as I felt momentum tipping subtly in my favor, a loud crash erupted from the overhead bin, scattering items across the aisle, startling everyone, including Karen, whose dramatic shriek momentarily faltered, and in that exact, suspended heartbeat, I seized my chance, executing a maneuver that had been forming in my mind since the beginning of the flight, a mix of verbal precision, body language, and timing designed to destabilize or control. And as I spoke with calm authority, citing boarding passes, airline policies, and common courtesy, I saw the first flicker of uncertainty cross her face, a crack in the armor of entitlement. And in that split second, the cabin collectively leaned forward, sensing that the tide was turning, while Karen, ever resourceful, attempted one last desperate gambit, waving her arms, demanding intervention, threatening legal action, even hinting at a viral social media post to shame me. And the tension skyrocketed, passengers on the edge of their seats, flight attendants frozen, the hum of the engines fading into the background as if the world itself had narrowed to this tiny aisle. And just as I prepared for final execution of my plan, a sudden jolt of turbulence threw everything into chaos, coffee spilling, a tray clattering, passengers gasping, and Karen lost her balance, teetering, precariously as if fate itself had intervened to provide an opening. And in that heart-stopping moment, I realized that the next move would decide not only who claimed the seat, but who controlled the narrative, the perception, the memory of this airborne showdown. And with every fiber of my being focused, I launched a decisive maneuver that had been building from the start, a clever, unexpected action that would leave Karen reeling, the passengers stunned, and the flight attendants speechless, setting the stage for the final chapter of this dramatic confrontation, where the resolution, vindication, and ultimate twist would all collide in an unforgettable climax, because at 32,000 feet, anything less than brilliance could mean defeat, humiliation, and a continuation of chaos that no one on the plane would soon forget. As the plane continued its steady flight through clouds that seemed to glow with the dying light of late afternoon, the final act of our airborne showdown began to unfold with precision and timing I had been cultivating in secret from the very moment Karen had claimed my seat. And as she stood once again, bracing herself for yet another theatrical display, I felt a surge of clarity, a calm amid the storm, knowing that all the tension, the whispers of passengers, the scrambles of flight, attendants, and the viral potential of her antics had built toward this decisive instant, and with a combination of assertive calm and strategic maneuvering, I gently but firmly reached over, retrieved my boarding pass, and with a tone so composed it almost disarmed the room, reminded her, loud enough for all within earshot, that the seat in question had been assigned to me, backed up by official documentation, airline policy, and the quiet, watchful eyes of nearby passengers who were already sensing the shift in control, and the moment seemed suspended, as if the entire plane had paused to witness the clash of wills. And for the first time, Karen's smirk faltered, her golden bob trembling slightly as she realized that her carefully curated narrative of dominance was being dismantled in real time. Yet she, stubborn to the core, attempted a final gambit, waving her arms, raising her voice to escalate her version of events. calling for flight attendants, threatening to involve airport security, and hinting at the viral storm she would unleash online. But the brilliance of the moment lay in the subtle, almost imperceptible preparation I had made over the course of the flight. Because while she had relied solely on theatrics and aggression, I had cultivated support, leveraged observation, and timed my actions to perfection. And as she lunged slightly forward in defiance, the plane hit a minor turbulence that sent her balance faltering just enough for me to calmly guide her, with minimal effort, into a temporary containment of space, gently but decisively reclaiming my seat and positioning her slightly off-center, leaving her flustered, off guard, and most importantly, unable to continue her performance without losing face. And the cabin reacted instantly, a wave of silent applause from glances, subtle smiles, and relieved chuckles rippling through passengers who had been holding their collective breath, while the flight attendants, initially tense and overwhelmed, finally exhaled, their expressions moving from stress to astonishment at the cleverness and composure of my intervention. And just when I thought the battle was fully resolved, Karen, desperate to salvage dignity, attempted one last verbal lunge, only for her phone to slip from her grip mid-speech, tumbling across the aisle, causing a domino effect of scattered items, startled gasps, and, most importantly, a viral-worthy spectacle that passengers quickly began capturing, ensuring that her own theatrics would become the centerpiece of social media mockery rather than a tool of intimidation. And in that moment of poetic justice, as she scrambled awkwardly to retrieve her phone while muttering indignantly, I settled into my rightful seat, the armrest firmly in place, my boarding pass secure, and a quiet triumph settling over me like the soft hum of engines resuming their rhythm, while Karen, still flustered and now acutely aware that her performance had spectacularly backfired, finally sank into a neighboring seat with a mixture of defeat, shock, and begrudging acknowledgement. And as the plane continued toward its destination, passengers resumed normal chatter, whispers of amusement and relief filling the cabin, with every eye occasionally flicking toward the fallen star chaos, while I allowed myself a small, victorious smile, knowing that not only had I reclaimed my seat, but I had orchestrated an elegant, unforgettable counter to entitlement itself. And somewhere deep in the back of the plane, I could sense the echoes of this confrontation spreading, a story that would be recounted, shared, and remembered as a day a screaming Karen attempted to dominate an airplane only to be bested by calm, strategy, and timing. And as the sun dipped below the horizon outside the window, painting the clouds in shades of gold and crimson, I leaned back, secured my seatbelt, and allowed the satisfaction of triumph, clever planning, and just a touch of karmic justice to wash over me, knowing full well that every passenger who witnessed the drama had carried home a lesson. Entitlement may roar, but patience, cunning, and composure can roar louder. In the final twist, the poetic closure of chaos turned to order, lingered in the air as the plane descended smoothly toward the runway, leaving Karen humbled, the cabin relieved, and me victorious, a silent hero of my own airborne saga, while somewhere behind me, a faint sound of muttering suggested she was already plotting her next confrontation, unaware that this story, captured in countless phone videos, would forever define her and, more importantly, my unforgettable victory at 32,000 feet. Just as the plane began its final descent toward the airport, and I thought the Karen saga had reached its natural conclusion, the cabin erupted once more, this time with a chaos that none of us could have predicted, because as passengers began gathering their belongings and exchanging relieved smiles, a sudden announcement over the intercom declared an unexpected mechanical issue, requiring an immediate diversion to a nearby airport, and a collective murmur of concern and anxiety rippled through the cabin, reigniting tension in a space that had only just begun to settle. And before anyone could fully process the news, Karen, who had been quietly fuming in her seat, seemed to sense an opportunity to reclaim some semblance of control, straightening her posture, straightening her golden bob with a flourish, and casting around for witnesses to her impending performance. But I had anticipated that her sense of entitlement wouldn't simply vanish with the resolution of the seat, dispute, and as she rose once again, determined to make herself the center of attention, I subtly activated the final part of my plan, a maneuver so clever in its simplicity that it relied not on confrontation, but on psychology, timing, and the perfectly orchestrated use of the plane's environment. And as the flight attendants approached to calm the renewed disturbance, I guided Karen toward a scenario in which her own momentum and drama, led her straight into the safety demonstration aisle, causing her to awkwardly entangle herself in her own bag, a coat, and a nearby passenger's jacket, producing a spectacle that left her red-faced, flustered, and utterly unable to continue her performance, while passengers around us erupted into stifled laughter, whispers of awe, and quiet applause for what had become a masterclass in patience, strategy, and composure. And in that precise moment, the twist became even more delicious. As Karen struggled to free herself, her phone slipped from her. Grasp again, this time hitting the floor with a loud clatter and activating her live video feed, broadcasting her continued humiliation to hundreds of followers, ensuring that the story of her entitlement rage and dramatic failures would go viral far beyond the cabin walls, while I leaned back, secure, victorious, and privately savoring the poetic justice, knowing that not only had I reclaimed my seat and dignity, but I had orchestrated an ending so unexpected that even the passengers who had watched in disbelief were now laughing, sharing, and replaying the scene in their minds. And as the plane finally touched down, rolling smoothly toward the gate, Karen sat defeated, slumped in her seat, muttering under her breath while nearby passengers exchanged knowing glances, and the final, subtle twist hit me. In all her attempt to dominate, threaten, and create chaos, she had inadvertently turned herself into the hero of the very viral story she had hoped to control, while I, calm and strategic, had emerged not just victorious, but almost invisible in the narrative she had written for herself. And as we disembarked, with passengers shaking their heads, smiling, and quietly recounting the saga for fellow travelers, I realized that in a single flight, in a single series of dramatic moments, entitlement had been humbled, strategy had triumphed, and chaos had been converted into an unforgettable story that would echo in airport lounges, social media feeds, and whispered conversations long after we had all gone our separate ways, leaving behind a lesson written in golden hair, shrieks, spilled coffee, and subtle victories. Sometimes a quiet, patient, and clever approach doesn't just win. You get to watch the storm unravel spectacularly, leaving your adversary to stew in the consequences of their own overconfidence, a final twist that no one in the cabin would ever forget.